We want to talk about tonight Israel diaspora Jewish relationship with a primary focus on diaspora Jews in the United States. We want to talk about the cultural ties and the tensions that have evolved from before the state, take it through the 50s and 60s. A benchmark moment might have been the 67 war and maybe the 73 war, but certainly Sadat's visit to Jerusalem and the peace process. I think it would be fair to say that a major impact on the relationship was Israel's management of the territories and the Palestinians, and what that has unfolded in different perceptions in American Jewry's eyes. But let me also state that the change in American Jewish relations with Israel, while it hasn't been dramatic, it hasn't been as if American Jews just decided that they weren't going to affiliate or make Israel their religion. And I mean that in all sense of the word. It was a great embrace of the state of Israel and a great adherence to the country. But there was some tensions at the beginning. And I think as we've gone past 7 decades, I think it's fair to say that major shifts have occurred because of demography, because we have a distance in American Jewry from World War II and the Holocaust. I think is a distance that's been created maybe because American Jews don't have a contemporaneous historical context like every Israeli does, because most of them, or 95% of them, serve in the army. And the generations have changed. And as generations changed, memories have changed. There's been assimilation in America. There's been a consciousness in American Jews with the advent of social media, the advent of the 24-hour news cycle, for American Jews to become more verbal, more demonstrative of their outlook and their opinions of things they like and things they don't like. And that includes their affiliation and affinity with the State of Israel. Dr. Stephen Bayme served as AJC's Director of Contemporary Jewish Life and also the AJC's Koppelman Institute on American Jewish-Israel Relations from 1882 to 2020. He holds undergraduate degrees from Yeshiva, MA and PhDs from history from Columbia. He's lectured widely across the country, taught at Yeshiva, Jewish Theological Seminary, Queens College. He currently holds a rank of visiting professor at Yeshiva Chovevei Torah. Steve will note, I'm sure, that we have in America today less number of Jews than there are in Israel. In other words, there's a major demographic shift which has occurred from the 40s to 2021. And we'll get down to the contemporary, we'll get down to the present, and we'll ask questions about what does it mean that Bibi Netanyahu is no longer in office after a decade. We'll talk about perhaps the Pew study, a whole series of issues we can talk about that relate to students on campus, that relate to how Israel is treated and managed and discussed in Jewish organizations, institutions, synagogue life. So, Steve, may I ask you to take the virtual podium?
Some of you may have seen the survey released by the American Jewish Committee, my long-term place of employment until I retired this past year. This week, they released a study on perceptions of Israel among American Jews, perceptions of American Jewry among Israelis. The common denominator between the two was how little each one knew of one another. So in that respect, in terms of education, in terms of how we understand one another, the work that all of you are doing in terms of teaching regarding Israel, it's of utmost importance in terms of building Israel diaspora ties. In terms of addressing the issue, I really would like to do 3 things. Number one, in broad strokes, give a sense of how the relationship has evolved over the course of the last 70 years. Obviously, this won't be a year-by-year survey. Rather, I'll divide it into 3 overarching periods. Number 2, take a look at the what I would call the 2 major interpretations currently in play in terms of Israel diaspora relations. One by Peter Beinart, his book, The Crisis of Zionism. The other by Gordis, his book, We Stand Divided. Both of them have their strengths. Both of them have their weaknesses. I have much stronger criticisms of Beinart than I do of Gordis. But in many ways, the two of them have set the discussion, the parameters of the discussion. So I'd like to take a look at both of them in terms of what their overall analysis and thesis is. Then bring us to where we are today. What ought to be done in terms of strengthening American Jewish-Israeli relations? What changes need to take place? What needs to evolve? What is our role as educators in terms of the classroom? In terms of the history, the most critical thing to understand is that the relationship has never been static. 1948 to 1967, first 2 decades of Israel's history, you might say there was a broad consensus among American Jews that Israel represented a fundamental shift in Jewish history in a very positive direction. But that said, very few picked up the energy and the funds to travel there. Israel was not really on the radar screen of American Jewish life. Even in times of war, like the 56 war, sure, Israel was in the news, but the reality was it didn't play a fundamental role in the definition of what American Jewry was all about. It was good to be out there. That said, it wasn't the major player. May of 67 is a fundamental dividing line. We always talk about June of 67. In terms of Israel-diaspora relations, May is even more important than June. Why? May evoked all the echoes of the 1940s. Daily threats to throw the Jews into the sea, to eliminate them as a people. The silence of the churches, the neutrality of the liberal world, the sense that the Jews stood alone. In that respect, the month of May was a bonding moment in terms of Israel-American Jewish relations. The difference from the 1940s is that this time the Jews pulled it off. This time it was successful. So in that respect, 67 inaugurates a period that I broadly would call the consensus period of American Jewish-Israeli relations, in which Israel becomes the vital center of American Jewish energies, in which, sure, there are always going to be problems in the relationship, but the overarching pro-Israel consensus is there. That pro-Israel consensus is defined by Jewish leadership as our job is to support the legally elected government of Israel, whether it's a government of the right or a government of the left. And again, if you take a look at the dates, 67 to 77 is a government of the left, Labor Party. 77 to 83 is the first Likud government. You then have a brief unity government. We'll see how that worked out. And then Likud continues until 92. So that notwithstanding an ascendancy of the Israeli right, the pro-Israel consensus becomes dominant in American Jewish life. That consensus begins to unravel in the 1990s. By the 21st century, it is pulled apart. Here we are in 2021. You're talking about two very different communities who, number one, have minimal understanding of one another, have a vague sense that they have something to do with one another, but increasingly one appears to be moving in a more traditionalist rightward direction, the other is moving in a more liberal universalist direction. That's in broad strokes how we've evolved. What I'd like to do is to get into in a bit greater detail and see what exactly have been the two major analyses of American Jewish-Israeli relations, one by Peter Beinart and the other by Daniel Gordis. Let me begin with Beinart. You'll find it again in his book, The Christ of Zionism, but in many ways a much better presentation of it was in an article that they wrote in the New York Review of Books in the summer of 2010 called The Failure of the American Jewish Establishment. What was that failure? I already alluded to it, that the stated policy of Jewish leadership was that we support the policies of the legally elected government of Israel, whether coming from the right or coming from the left. In that respect, Beinart picked up on the fact that Jewish leadership said it is not our job to be criticizing Israeli policy, let alone doing so in Washington before American circles of power. Second, the price of that policy has been the alienation of the next generation. Beinart's conclusion is that the next generation will have to choose between becoming Orthodox supporters of Israel, such as the West Bank settlers movement, or drifting away, distancing themselves from Israel completely. That's the Beinart thesis. That's why he calls this piece The Failure of the American Jewish Establishment, that the establishment is not listening to the voices of its young people. Now, is that correct? The recently released Pew Survey, 2020, gives a great deal of credibility in terms of data to Beinart's thesis. Let me share a bit of it with you. For Jews under age 30, 48% define themselves as attached to Israel, either very attached or attached. Means 52% do not. Jews over age 65, say my generation, that of Ken, it's 67%. In other words, a 20 percentage point gap in terms of attachment to Israel between millennials and senior citizens. Among millennials, only 35% regard Israel as essential to their Jewish identity. Compare that to, again, senior citizens, it's 52%. Again, close to a 20% gap. Perhaps more surprisingly, among millennials, 13%, 1 in 8, define themselves as supporters, or at least sympathetic, to the BDS movement. Now, before you take all that literally, you can argue that in a survey like that, saying you're pro-BDS may be a very fluid statement, meaning I don't know how much I know about it, I don't know how much I've heard. What I've heard, I tend to like, but I might change my mind tomorrow. But the fact that 13% say they're supportive of a movement that delegitimizes Israel's very entity as a state, that's a statement of distancing, of drifting away from Israel. And then there's the most important question. Has the United States been too supportive of Israel? Among the entire Jewish population, 29% feel that America has been too supportive of Israel. Among millennials, it's 37%. Compare that with 2013, only 8 years ago. In 2013, 10% of the overall population thought America had been too supportive. Among millennials, it was 25%. But then you have the clincher in the entire Pew survey, namely that Orthodox Jews are represented twice as often as among millennials than they are in the general Jewish population. Why is that? Among adult Jews, only 9% are Orthodox. But among Jews 18 to 30, the millennial population, 17% are Orthodox. What that in effect means is that the Orthodox vote, if you will, counts twice as much among millennials as it would in the general population. Well, the Orthodox vote, 99% of it, would answer all the questions I've just given you in a very pro-Israel direction. They would not believe America's been too supportive of Israel. So in that respect, when the data indicates that 13% of millennials say are sympathetic to BDS, and you realize that it's 0.001% among the Orthodox, and the Orthodox are represented twice as frequently among the millennials, you have what might be called in general a distancing from Israel among the younger generation. In fairness, my colleagues at Brandeis believe that this is simply a matter of age, that give people more time as they get older, they'll be more mature and they'll be as supportive of Israel, say, as the previous generation was. That's a leap of faith, and it's based upon really one question in the surveys, namely, do you feel close to Israel? Again, I don't know what that means. My niece would argue, sure, I feel close to Israel. I met my husband that way. Has she ever been to Israel? Could she tell you what are the major issues confronting Israel? No, but most American Jews will say in one form or another, of course I feel close to Israel. So the fact that the Brandeis researchers pinpoint that question doesn't overwhelm me. Is Beinart right on the cultural issue of, in other words, is he correct on the distancing itself? Yes, the data support him. Is he right on the cultural issues of should American Jews be distancing themselves from Israel? There, I believe he makes three fundamental mistakes. Number one, the reason the establishment has been so supportive of Israel and saying we support the legally elected government has to do with a historical memory. In the 1930s, if you will, Breckinridge Long, Roosevelt's refugee officer, wrote down in his diary, it makes no sense to do anything for the Jews. There are 50 Jewish delegations, all descending on Washington. If you try to accept the program of one of them for relief and rescue, you'll only be alienating 49 others. That statement by Long, whether they read it or not, that image, that memory, was very, very uppermost in the minds of Jewish leadership back in the 1950s. Namely, let's not repeat that error, that disunity among Jews in Washington before centers of power will attenuate Jewish influence and Jewish power. Beinart shows no sensitivity to that historical memory. Second, there's also no sensitivity to the context of why has the Israeli government moved so far rightward over the past 7 decades? Because of what Israel is up against, namely surrounded by people who want to eliminate her. And again, perhaps in terms of contemporary times, you can't begin to understand the Gaza war if you don't begin with the Hamas covenant. The covenant 1988 is one of the most anti-Semitic documents of the 20th century, but it says negotiations with the Zionist entity are forbidden on theological principle. In 2017, Hamas received some good advice that they should clean up some of the anti-Semitism in the document, don't be so crude about it. And they did so, except that the core of the document remains intact. The existence of Israel as a Jewish state is theologically sinful. Beinart, again, ignores that context of what Israel is up against. And last, in terms of the distancing of American Jews, even he admitted he made one fundamental mistake, what I would call a third error. He ignored the issue of assimilation, namely that distancing from matters Jewish generally will lead to distancing from Israel. In other words, that it's a fairly obvious point. If you're not interested in Jewish life, why spend your time on what's happening 7,000 miles away in some godforsaken area of the Middle East? So in that respect, when Beinart argues it is the policies of the Jewish establishment that are distancing American Jews from Israel, he himself admitted later that no, the real cause of the distancing is assimilation itself. Now, how does that compare with Gordis? Danny Gordis writes an important book called We Stand Divided, in which he argued that it's not about politics. It's about the type of society, the type of culture operative within Israel and within the American Jewish community. And they're two very different cultures, essentially, in terms of their core essence. Israel increasingly is particularistic, survivalist, tribalist, a post-Holocaust society in which the aspiration for return to sovereignty and statehood overwhelmed all other considerations, namely having gone through the Holocaust, having picked up, if you will, from the ashes of Auschwitz, the drive to return to sovereignty, to create a Jewish state that would be responsible for its own destiny, overwhelmed all other considerations. Best example of that might be Menachem Begin, who during the Lebanon War of 1982, when he was criticized for the bombing of Beirut, he said, "No one can lecture us about morality. We remember Dresden, we remember Hiroshima, and we remember Auschwitz." In that respect, the imperative driving Israel from its very creation was survivalist and particularistic. Contrast that with American Jewry. We are, if you will, children of the Enlightenment, a sense of universalism, liberalism without question, commonly referred to as tikkun olam, a word that has a long and checkered history, most of which has very little to do with its contemporary usage and implication. But essentially, it's become a code word. That what is it to be a Jew? To repair the world. In that respect, American values of welcoming the stranger, celebrating difference, American pluralism, all wonderful values that have made the United States more welcoming of Jewish participation than any society in diaspora Jewish history. Those values that are essential to our self-definition and self-identity of what it means to be a Jew are values that are relatively marginal or at best secondary within Israeli society. In other words, you've got a clash of survivalism and particularism versus liberalism and universalism. In plain English, it means Israel has drifted rightward. It's a much far more traditionalist society today, say, than it was in 1967. That drift rightward has been consistent over 6 decades or 5.5 decades. American Jewry since 1945 has operated with the liberal consensus that to be an American Jew is to work for the betterment of the world around us. Part of that is, again, inherent in the very notion of contemporary liberalism, namely the liberal imagination, and this again goes back to the Enlightenment, is the assumption that people basically will do the right thing if given good conditions. When they don't do the right thing, it's because the conditions have led them down the wrong path. In the Israeli imagination, doing the right thing, say, was Oslo. You put a good deal on the table, and rather than adapting to the conditions that are being offered, the response is that of rejection of Oslo, continued warfare, bombing of Jews, even within the Green Line, let alone on the West Bank. In that respect, the liberal imagination of American Jews in many ways runs very counter to a far more pessimistic, conservative imagination of Israeli society. Best example I can give to you of all this is just take it from recent data, the performance of President Biden on Israel and Middle East. 70% of American Jews feel Biden did a fine job in terms of the Gaza war. Among Israelis, only 18%. Say nothing of the attitudes versus Trump and Netanyahu of the previous 4 years. But when I say that Gordis is arguing from a position of strength, that you have two societies working in two very different directions, I think he's onto something. That why is it we have so much difficulty relating to one another? Because we differ essentially. We differ in terms of the kind of societies that we're trying to build. What's to be done? What steps might be taken? What should be emphasized in terms of teaching about Israel? I'd like to say first that there are things that should not be done. And unfortunately, some of those things have come from Israeli leadership, even within recent days. Former Israeli ambassador in the United States, Ron Dermer, gave an interview a couple weeks ago in which he said, we really don't need conservative Reform Jews in Israel. We don't need their support. Why? We have the Orthodox, and they're increasingly ascendant in terms of Jewish public life. And we have the evangelicals. Dermer conveniently forgot about the fact younger evangelicals are less supportive of Israel than older evangelicals. But he was really saying the American Jewish community is of far less significance because the liberal base of American Jews are going to disappear anyway by dint of assimilation. Thankfully, Dani Dayan, former consul general of Israel in New York City, rebuked Dermer, saying in no uncertain terms that you don't really know what you're talking about. Forget about the fact that we need conservative Reform Jews in terms of the Democratic Party. The imperative of peoplehood alone means that we need to care about the future of American Jewry. We need stronger relations with them rather than writing them off. Unfortunately, Dermer does not speak only for himself. His views are, I won't say widely shared, but they're shared somewhat within circles of power, circles of leadership within Israeli society. But the issue of peoplehood, I would submit, is probably the single greatest challenge in terms of teaching. If peoplehood matters, then our relationship with Israel follows immediately. If we don't care about what happens to other Jews, if our Jewish identity is entirely individualistic rather than collective, if we say, follow Hannah Arendt, who once argued, I don't have any love for the Jewish people, I love only my friends. If our concept of who we are as Jews is entirely an individual matter and not part of the collectivity, then the relationship of Israel is of no significance. The issue is, what is Israel's role in terms of that Jewish collectivity? And here the history is actually quite inspiring. Israel absorbed 800,000 refugees from Arab lands. Israel absorbed, not as successfully, but 1 million refugees from the Soviet Union. And in more recent years, Israel struggled with, but also absorbed about 100,000 Ethiopian Jews, what we would call today, if you will, an indication that Zionism is anything but racism. But that sense of peoplehood, that all Jews are responsible for one another, all Jews need one another, is one of the primary validations of why a state of Israel at all, as a central expression of the peoplehood of the Jews. Thirdly, part of the problem in teaching about Israel is that we tend to teach about Israel through its worst moments, the moments that grab the headlines, issues of war, issues of terrorism. The notion of Israel holistically as a democratic society, as a pluralist society, as a society that is treated as minorities, as well as might be imagined under these conditions, as a society that's been vibrant in terms of Jewish intellectual life. All those narratives often get lost in favor of the narrative of war, battles. The early heroic story of Israel, if you will, was the kind of Hanukkah story, the few against the many. Israel, surrounded by 7 Arab nations, managed to defeat them. That story is 1948. Perhaps it got a boost in 67. The last 50 years has been a story that war is hell. And sure, there have been victories to celebrate, but there's been a ton of defeats as well. In that respect, the teaching of Israel, I would suggest, needs to take a much broader look of what is the state of Israel holistically, as a culture, as a society, as a polity, and not only as a nation of war. And that leads me perhaps to a more sensitive point, that in saying we need to see ourselves holistically, not as opposed to seeing ourselves at our worst, we often supremacize our own values and our own understanding over that of the other, over that of Israeli values and Israeli understanding. Let me give you one simple example, but and perhaps not the most important one, but I think it speaks volumes. The broad consensus among American Jews is that Israel violated, or Netanyahu violated, a solemn promise, the so-called compromise over the Western Wall, for egalitarian prayer at the Western Wall. The compromise was reached in good faith in 2013. It is yet to be implemented 8 years later. Is that only a breach of faith, or is that about something else? Namely, that Israel has a problem that American Jewry is completely oblivious to. Namely, it has 1 million ultra-Orthodox citizens who may either integrate into the state or may distance themselves from the state. In other words, Israel's fundamental problem is not about who's praying at the Western Wall. Its fundamental problem is how are we going to coexist with 1 million people who do not share our Zionist vision? Are we going to beat them over the head and say, yeah, you've controlled the wall up until now, but no longer? Or are we going to try to reach some accommodations, some agreements with them? The prime minister tried to argue that he was supporting the operational aspects of it, not the ideological aspects. In other words, the compromise of the Western Wall had both operational aspects and aspects of principle. He said, we'll make it work practically. Well, we won't make it work ideologically. You can disagree with that. But to be insensitive to it and to say the Western Wall belongs to the entire Jewish people, which it does. We want to pray there in an egalitarian manner, which by and large American Jews do, and be oblivious to the fact that you have 1 million Israelis who are right there on the spot who say the Western Wall is the holiest spot in Judaism. We're not prepared to compromise or give up our sacred space in that regard. Again, I'm not offering judgment here. Frankly, I wish the compromise had worked. But I'm saying when we teach about one another, recognize the problems and dynamics, the challenges that each side faces. That leads me really to a last conclusion, and with that, we'll open it up and have responses and presentations. But let me offer one final, perhaps more controversial aspect. It's related to the last one, but in more broader strokes. American Jews have one fundamental challenge. They have many challenges, but there's one overarching challenge, and I've already alluded to it in terms of the Pew data. And that is that American Jewry, while it has built some incredibly vibrant institutions, that it's been a strong center of Jewish life, it faces the very real problem of assimilation. You want to talk about Pew? The most remarkable thing about Pew is that you have 2 million people with one Jewish parent, 2 million adults who say we are no longer Jews. That's a loss any way you cut it. And those losses will only continue as the process of assimilation continues. That means, in effect, that American Jewry, in terms of defining itself, needs to confront its own weakness, which is that of our future continuity is at stake. For Israelis, living in a majority Jewish society, the issue is not continuity, it's survival. Now, Israelis like to talk about assimilation because it makes them feel good that we're not assimilating. American Jews like to talk about pluralism because it makes us feel good that we're pluralistic and we accept different models of Judaism, and we'd rather not talk about assimilation. Both sides need to talk about both its strengths and its weaknesses. And a serious dialogue between American Jewry and Israel should not be, well, we know you're assimilating and we know we're not assimilating. It needs to be a very balanced discussion of both sides have their strengths, both sides have their weaknesses, and both sides need one another.